to do over and over and over again. And for the longest time, I was avoiding it because I really don't like the concept of generations where you sweep everybody into a sort of generalization. But I came across a book by Gretchen McCulloch called Because Internet that really helped me. She did a great job of pointing out what the things are that really get missed between generations, that are those things that you just don't think to ask about, while still respecting the individuality of people and how some of these traits, yes, we can cast assumptions, but also we have people who break those molds all the time. So I really like that, especially since as a beginning professional, I was someone who constantly, I was hearing, I'm Gen Z myself, so I kept hearing, oh no, the Gen Z, they're just so terrible. It is kind of nice to hear, oh no, Gen Alpha, they are scary, because now it's moved off of Gen Z a little bit, but I still hear it, and I think it's unfair to do that, so I just put this together. I hope you guys, please interrupt me or wave me down if you have questions. What I thought I would do is I'm going to go through some generational profiles. I'll tell you a little bit about the work I've done at Johnson County, what they can kind of lead us to believe, and then I'll open it up for questions. That sound okay to everybody? Cool. Okay. So first, of course, you have the silent generation. If we are thinking about higher education, we still do have a couple members of this generation, although they are slowly working their way out. This is going to be a very small percentage of our workforce. But really, I want you to consider the silent generation, how they really formed their personality. And when we talk about generations in general, the things that affect us the most are from ages 6 to 24. So from 6 to 12-ish, we are highly influenced by our family, our familial culture, those individuals that are just grounding us in our home life. So that's why you listen to your parents. If you have cousins around, you're going to be very similar to them if you have older siblings. Then from 12 to 24-ish, we start to say, you know, my parents aren't really that cool. I think my peers are a little bit cooler. And that's when we really start to see an expansion in our expansion. Oh, so sorry, I said that twice. In our expansion of language, of norms, and that building of our identity. So then at 25, 26-ish, we start to change less and less of those things about ourselves because we're more confident in ourselves as a person. But I like having that psychology background because that means that it doesn't just matter if you were born between this year and this year. It matters how old your parents were. Were you the youngest of all of your cousins and you hung out with them a lot? Or were you the oldest of all of your cousins? That means that your preferences are going to be dragged one way or the other. And so each person really truly is exceptionally unique in which of these stereotypes they tend to align with. And I think that's a really cool thing to remember, just to treat everyone as an individual, not as a mass group. But when we think about silent generation, typically you're going to see that they were born between 1922 and 1945. Think about the experiences that shaped their worldview. They saw the World War, the Second World War. They saw rebuilding after that. They saw the Great Depression. And they're also the generation, if you're thinking United States specifically, that built our current infrastructure. You had FDR, you had the New Deal, you had the highways, all of these different things. But the most important is that our silent generation, they understand how to do without and how to be creative because they also lived in the United States before the period of convenience, right? If you wanted a pizza, you had to make the pizza. You couldn't call up Domino's. So they figured out how to do it. They usually tended their own gardens. They had all of these sorts of things. You will typically hear them described as dependable, resilient, hardworking, and patient. Their significant events included Great Depression, World War II, Red Scare, right when a lot of them were reaching into that time where they came into their voice and their autonomy. As they're becoming adults, now there is all of this political tension, and of course, the Civil Rights Movement. And then because I think it's important, I like to include every single generation is not very nice to the generation after them. So I like to include little quotes just as a reminder that we are stuck a little bit in a cycle and it's okay. But the previous generation, they said about the silent generation, this group is unimaginative, withdrawn, unadventurous, and cautious. And I love that because this group was the one who put their heads down and they got to work. They were the first ones who could kind of see an existence outside of what they had always experienced, even though they couldn't quite grasp it. And again, you have kind of these really scary events going on that are shaping how comfortable you feel integrating into society. If we move on to our baby boomers, we typically 1946 through 1964, this group experienced the world in post-war economic expansion, right? After World War II, we had the boom. Now with all of these extra people, we need more things to happen. We're starting to see the benefits of that infrastructure because it's actually being actualized. This is the first self-actualized generation, so they did not have to do what every generation before them had done. This group was the one, they really exploded college populations. They were absolutely more educated than their parents before them. Because of this, there was a ton of competition. There was a ton of competition to get into school, to get into these jobs. And so you see a lot of that competition, that competitiveness, and that I'm going to put my head down and I'm going to work to get ahead kind of attitude. You see that we've got the civil rights movement and we move into Woodstock, moon landing, and assassinations. So we start to see a little bit of, we go from really repressed to a lot of kind of much less repression. We have possibilities that have never been seen before. And then we have a significant event that hasn't happened in the United States in a long time. I also think it's really important to note in the United States, this, as they were growing up, this generation was the least diverse. And that's because the United States had very strict immigration laws where we were barely accepting immigrants. And if we were, they were mostly Western European from 1922 to 1953-ish. And so as this generation was growing up, they really did not have as much exposure to other cultures as we think of our American experience today. So I think that's very important to remember. Boomers are creating a me generation that's rooted in post-war prosperity. Does me generation sound familiar to anybody? I think it's kind of funny that they just kind of like repackaged it. They were like, we don't want this anymore. Someone else can have it. You see that they generally have a very strong work ethic. They're very self-assured. They are collaborative. They enjoy working with people. You see that in studies even today. People from this generation typically prefer to solve things face-to-face. You have word of mouth, which is how so many recommendations were shared. And then we hit a really interesting 180. So our forgotten generation, which I did not forget, Gen X, 1965 to 1980. This was the first generation, again, in the United States to grow up without a large adult presence because we started to see more, after World War II, the baby boomers, the women were working and then they went back home. And this new generation was like, well, I'm going to go to college and my mom works, so why can't I? So you see both parents working. They also missed the economic boom when they got to the workforce. So by the time they got there, the baby boomers, there were just so many of them, and there was so much creativity and expansion in our infrastructure, in our economic system in the United States, that we kind of ran out of ideas by the time this generation was ready to join the workforce. So you'll see that this generation is the most entrepreneurial. They are the most likely generation, or have been, to go out and just start their own thing because it was really tough for them to find some of these opportunities. Additionally, they were very individualistic. I have a coworker here who is proudly a member of this generation, and she remembers that there was a commercial on at 9 o'clock at night for parents asking, do you know where your children are? Because they just ran outside and they played all day, and you really hoped they made it back at the end of the day. So super individualistic, very adept at problem solving, very independent. You also start to see a little bit more chaos in our significant events. The fall of the Berlin Wall, which is wonderful, but also was kind of a movement started by community. The Challenger exploding. Another member of Gen X told me that he was in grade school when this happened. They wheeled out the big TV. They saw the Challenger take off. They saw a tragedy happen. And then they didn't really know what to do about it. They kind of just moved on to the next class because it was so unexpected and people were not prepared. You go into another really devastating AIDS pandemic, another very scary time, 9/11. And you can see how each of these things would hit just as someone is reaching that precipice of adulthood and how that would change the way they interact going forward. This generation is touted as being very efficient, very optimistic because they are able to find success because of that internal drive. But they are described by the boomers as aimless, unfocused 20-somethings who are bleak, cynical, and disaffected. I get it. I get it if you have some like tough stuff and you're having trouble with the job market, as was happening with these individuals. Colleges are having to go through a really major shift and they're really adapting. It makes sense that things are going to be a little bit more difficult. We go on to millennials, 1981 to 1996-ish. This is the first generation to be economically worse off than their parents, and that is really because of debt and student loans in general. They are the first generation to integrate technology into their daily lives, and because of that technology, because of also things like the 24-hour news cycle, the constant access to information, they start to experience belonging by wanting to impact the world, not just their corner of it, but a much larger, they want a larger piece of the pie because they can see more of it. Their significant events are going to be 9/11, the recession of 2007, rise of school shootings in general, and the rise of the internet. So of course in Gen X we had some early adopters of that internet, but millennials, almost every single one, grew up adapting with the constant changes. So generally they're considered to be very creative, adaptable, tech savvy, socially conscious to a degree, but some people like to call them narcissistic, lazy, smartphone obsessed kids who still live with their parents. Another me generation. Can you tell? I just enjoy this so much. I love just going over these things. And then that brings us to Gen Z. I have not included Gen Alpha in this presentation yet because we're not going to start seeing them at community colleges until 2030, because of course, if we consider what most people consider Gen Alpha, they weren't born until 2013. But Gen Z, we have only known a world with global unrest, war, financial crises. And the reason that we know about that is because of that 24-hour news cycle, that constant barrage of media, and that access to technology. And so a couple experts have felt that this is the reason that this generation is growing up with so many mental health struggles, because we just were not designed as humans for this much input, this much stimulation. They generally value inclusive, supportive communities. As we have, of course, seen differences in immigration, we've seen different generations grow up with very different perspectives of diversity and inclusion. They have little to no memory of the world before smartphones, which I think is really important to remember. And then some of our significant events here: rise of social media. Social media started using UX algorithms and AI directed algorithms as early as 2006. So having that very tailored experience is something this group has grown to expect. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, especially if you have those individuals who were graduating high school and getting into college while we were in that lockdown period, you may have noticed we have a little 5-year gap where we have individuals who are really struggling with social skills and norms that are on the same page as everybody else. Those who graduated college before the pandemic and those who graduated college after the pandemic, they still have those skills, but we do have this little 5-year gap. And then I've got Luigi Mangione. I don't know if anyone is familiar with who that is, but it's something that I'm keeping an eye on because it's something that, of course, like blew up on TikTok, and I'm just trying to see where it goes and what this generation does with it, because it was a really hot topic and it stayed around for longer than a lot of other trends. So it's just something I'm keeping an eye on. You have some people saying that millennials, they don't know the value of a hard day's work. They ask for too much. They do too little. They don't like hierarchies. They don't want to pay their dues. They're always looking at their phone, and they quit their jobs instead of miserably sticking it out, which I just think is a very lovely sentence to say about Gen Z. So when we think about it, I'll just take you through this very quick kind of idea of how each of these generations experience college, since we are in higher education. And if you were a student in 1930, you were a silent generation student. You were mailed a course announcement booklet. Probably weren't, all colleges were one specific specialization for the most part. You had the teachers college, the engineers college. You didn't have colleges with many offerings, very low enrollment, limited major choices, and a very structured experience, right? You can only withdraw if you're given permission. We have that hierarchical structure, which is very important to generations prior to millennials. You have to register in person. You see this booklet that they had to choose their classes from. You move on to the next group's kind of experience in college. I'm so sorry. Previous was the greatest generation. This is the silent generation's experience in college. You register for classes in person 2 days before classes. Still have pretty limited major choices. Still have limited enrollment, but it is a little bit more accessible than it was because we've started building out this infrastructure. You see, when the boomers start to enter college around 1970, we have so much college enrollment. Students are choosing classes out of a giant catalog. It's inefficient. There's not a lot of class choices, but there's a lot of people who want to pursue this. So this is when we start seeing majors split into smaller and smaller and more niche factions, because we have to make room for all these people who are interested in education. And we just simply do not have room for them unless we expand. Gen X starts going to college in 1990s. This is when colleges start experimenting. They're finally receiving a little bit of relief after that huge boom. We've got less enrollment, so we can start trying new things. We can try to make students a little bit more independent. It's not so much we do everything for you, and we've started to build out those programs. We have more choices. You look at millennials, 2010, we switched to online class registration, very much a self-service model. Advisors give options, but students are treated as kind of the expert. You have these degree progress websites. You start using things like Rate My Professor. We start to have this much more niche tailored experience because we can choose all these different classes. And as long as it is in this category, it's going to be okay. And then you have Gen Z, staggered online enrollment. You have more online enrollment than you have in-person enrollment. You have way more class and elective options than ever before, which is something that KBOR has been kind of looking at. I'm not sure if you all remember, but there was a period of time where they were like, maybe not every state college should have the same bachelor's degree. Maybe we should diversify this a little bit more. So we're starting to see things like this. You see that these things are getting less structured because there is more choice, there is more personalization, and that means it makes it so much more difficult to help each and every single person in the way that each and every single person is needed to have help with. We also see that with all of these expanding niches and these expanding, these expanding focuses, that the idea of expertise is really changing between all of these generations. Something that I hear a lot of strife and strife from a lot of individuals is that Gen Z, millennials, they don't respect hierarchy. And one thing that I think is really important to remember is that if you have silent generation baby boomers who were raised in a very military hierarchical, you have World War II, you have that national pride, and your only source of news is from local paper to your local radio station to TV, you see how we're expanding access. By the time the millennials get around, they have access to see so many people having all of these decisions and possibly not making the best decisions, right? And still, and either not being held responsible or not doing maybe what they think they should have done because they have access to this information they've never had before. So now these later generations are moving more towards, they want you to prove that you can trust them. That's how they start relationships off, rather than having an implicit trust in the people around them. That is a huge difference. That is, it's really shocking, and it's really hard for a lot of people to kind of wrap their heads around. Okay, last thing, and then we can open it up. This I thought was really fun. especially when you think about the differences. If you think about silent gen and boomers, their default state is productivity. And a time before convenience, if you idle hands are wanting hands, right? You are always doing something. You know how to sew, you know how to do all these things. You have those home ec classes, productivity. We start having technology be more and more frequent, and we start to be more efficient. Now we don't necessarily have to be idle. So our default state is boredom. You know, I can just grab that dress from the store. I don't have to make it, or I can just give this to a tailor to hem it. I don't have to do it myself. And then you move to Gen Z, and Gen Alpha will be included in here. Anxiety. Not only do they have the efficiency of technology, but there is more things filling that void and more things that are competing for the attention. Social media is intentionally designed to be addictive, right? Those algorithms are intentionally designed to keep you in as long as possible. So you have that there is always something going on. It's much harder for these generations to experience true rest, which is contributing a little bit to their increased kind of sense of anxiety. It's harder for them just to take a chill pill, so to speak. With that, I highly recommend the book Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch, because she talks about so many things that I don't have time to get into today because I want to make sure we can talk a little bit. But things how, like if you have a child or a partner or a friend who's a different age than you, and they react to your text differently, right? If I were to tell everyone, hey, just checking in, ... I don't know if anyone knows, but that ... is very contentious in some circles. That's very passive aggressive to some generations, and to some people, they really don't care very much about it. It's just a thought separator. So those little things that are so normal to you that you don't even consider to think that that might be the problem, or that might be the hiccup you're experiencing. So with that, do we want to open it up to a conversation? Do you want me to show you an example? How would we like to proceed?
If you have an example, I think that would be great, and then we can open it up.
Okay, sure. Sweet. Okay. We'll go back to sharing the screen. There we go. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to fast forward a little bit here. Actually, yeah, we'll do this one. Okay, so consider this email you get from a younger coworker. It says, hey, what's up? Do you have time to talk about the project today? So far, so good. And we have a star-eyed emoji. So just in general, what do you guys think about this? What are your first thoughts as you come across a message like this?
Anybody have any ideas?
And there's no wrong answers.
I think depending on who you are, it might be considered unprofessional in a professional setting because you're using emojis and you didn't call me by my name, just, hey, what's up? You know, more like you're my best friend versus a colleague who may not be on that same level of familiarity.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other opinions or thoughts or ideas?
I know me, I'm not sure what the star eyes emoji is. Like, I would like, it doesn't seem like love to me, but it just seems like, I guess I just don't know what it means.
Mm-hmm. So I really like this example because when I created this example, my thoughts were all in the emojis, right? If you think about how people were communicating, you know, you have face-to-face, you have all of those facial cues, you have your tics, you can pick up all of those nonverbals. You move to phone, and you notice that, you know, people have kind of a phone voice, and people will spend hours and hours on the phone. If you think of that kind of Gen X-ish generation, they love being on the phone. They love being able to share that about their days. And you still have those cues in the voice. Millennials are moving on to chat rooms, right? And especially when it is expensive to send text messages, but this is the new thing. You have to get a lot of information across in a limited amount of characters. So we start to see people really depend on emojis. And then you keep using that for a couple of years, and Gen Z doesn't exactly feel comfortable using, creating sentence structures without adding that extra context in there. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, like the millennial exclamation mark, like they end everything with an exclamation mark. Gen Z is kind of using emojis in that way. I want you to make sure that you know that this is just being nice. I'm not trying to be aggressive or anything like that. Oh, so sorry. But the thing that really got a lot of people that I did not even consider when I've been presenting this is I've had a lot of people be like, hey, it's for horses. This is not how you refer to a human being. And I had to go back and I had to change so many of my emails because this, hey, is a standard greeting to me. It's not something, but talking to people from different experiences, backgrounds, generations, they say, no, I want you to refer to me, give me a proper salutation, hello, good morning, and use my name. And don't ask me what's up. That's not professional enough. I love talking people through, especially Gen Z, when they were creating their norms. If they had their first few jobs working from home, they didn't have anyone who, you know, they could elbow and say, hey, can you check this out? Can you let me know if it's professional or not? Or, hey, what do you think of my outfit today? And essentially they survived. They weren't fired for the most part because people were like, you know what, it's not that big of a deal in the scheme of things. But as we've come back to an in-person culture, we have people who are expecting those prior standards and expectations that have never really been explained to Gen Z, or they've think in their minds, you know, I can do the job without this. It doesn't affect my job, so why does it matter? And it's a conversation that a lot of people don't generally have. How do you write emails? How do you address individuals? Do you use Teams or Outlook for contacting people? They're conversations that I've been encouraging teams to have every time they experience turnover, because no matter what generation you're from, everyone's going to have a different preference. And unless you set those standards, you know, no one's a mind reader. It's really difficult for everyone to be on the same page. Especially when common sense is not quite so common anymore. I love that saying. But your common sense also doesn't necessarily equate to everyone's common sense. And that's where that frustration, I think, really comes in between generations. Like, oh, this is so obvious. This is so easy. Not necessarily in everyone's experience.
Great. Well, we are close to time, but I think we could ask one, question if anybody has a question for Carissa.
I know this was brief, but did this like strike a light bulb in anyone for maybe like something you've been experiencing lately, or put organization to a thought you've been having?
It does for me. This is Nicole. It does for me because there's people that will come up, appreciate you. And to me, that comes off really rude, but they don't mean it as rude or disrespectful. But to me, it doesn't sound sincere. So I've had that discussion with several people in here about that. And yeah, so this was kind of interesting.
Thank you so much for sharing.
No. Well, thank you, Carissa, for being here. I'm sure she'll stick around for a minute or two if anybody else has any other questions. But thank you guys for participating. And I know it definitely brought a lot of thoughts to my mind. And I think it's always good to get a refresher, especially as I get older and move up the generational chain. It's good to have little reminders and to think a little bit outside of what my norm might be. So appreciate you joining us today, Carissa. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right. So people are popping off. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did for Carissa. I think at one point you mentioned a book, like at the end of your PowerPoint before you gave the text example, but I didn't write it down fast enough. Can you tell me that again?
Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch. I can put it in the chat too, so you're not guessing on names.
I put the title in the chat, but I didn't
Thank
put
you.
the author. If you want to add that, that'd be
I'm
great.
Gen X, so I'm writing it down. I'm not. Can you tell me the, oh, there it is. I see it. Thank
Mhm.
you.
And it was just published in 2018, so it's fairly recent. If you want something that covers like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, Algo Speak by Alec Alexi covers especially like the really weird